Hey, I'm Funmi Fetto, and this is On Reflection, the beauty podcast with a global view on beauty. Today's episode is in association with Murad Skincare, the clinical but cool doctor brand that takes a whole person approach to skin wellness and sets the bar for high-performance skincare. Later in the show, I'm joined by the GenZ founders behind the hottest beauty brand right now, Topicals. They'll be sharing the inspiration behind the brand that hopes to transform the way we feel about skin. But first, required reading, where we discuss beauty news topics and features that have caught our attention. Joining me is Phoebe McDowell, the assistant editor at Bureau 24/7 and former beauty editor at Sunday Times Style. Phoebe, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
No, thank you for coming on again.
I know, a joy.
It is a joy. I love the stories you chose this week, by the way. I think they're all great. The first one I'd like to talk about is in Glamour. And it's not actually the story in and of itself. It's the cover of Glamour with Emma Corrin from The Crown, showing off a huge tuft of body hair, underarm hair. And it's something that a lot of people have been talking about. There's been so much coverage around it.
First and foremost, like the rest of the world, I am obsessing over The Crown because, of course, Diana just has been introduced. So I swallowed it whole and then was furiously Googling anything that I could read around it, which brought me to this interview by a friend of both of ours, Josh Newis-Smith. It touches on loads of facets of beauty and womanhood, from body hair and adult acne to eating disorders. But obviously, as you say, the main and most visual takeaway was the cover. After I saw this, I did a wee bit of research, and Mintel actually reports that 1 in 4 women have now stopped shaving their armpits altogether. And I kind of found it almost comical at the start of lockdown how many op-eds there were about armpit hair. And I don't mean that to sound flippant or irreverent about how symbolic body hair is and about what a sticking point it is for feminism. But Emma Corrin summed it up perfectly in the piece when she said stopping shaving was a really underwhelming realization. And I thought, yeah, of course it is. It's hair, it grows, it sits there, it doesn't do a right lot in the end. We've moved on from this idea that body hair is unattractive or unworthy by now, thankfully. But it still feels quite a raw and real and provocative statement for such a commercially minded magazine like Glamour to put on their cover.
I think it is such a statement still when we see someone on the cover of a magazine with underarm hair or leg hair or even facial hair. It is a provocative statement. I agree with that. I don't know if I agree that we have moved on. I absolutely don't think so. The pandemic in many ways has forced us to stop thinking about that aspect of, and I put this in inverted commas, that aspect of grooming. We're in lockdown right now. No one's going anywhere. There are no social occasions. Beauty services aren't accessible. And then I think the second thing is that it's made people think a little bit deeply about why they're getting rid of their body hair and who they're doing it for and what they're doing it for. And like you, I thought Emma Corrin's thought process on the matter was quite insightful. You know, she said she's been meaning to grow it out for quite a few years, but I'm recently single. I haven't done it before because I've been in a relationship, and I guess I've been programmed to think that I should probably shave for the benefit of both parties. And I thought that was quite interesting, that I guess we're programmed in many ways to think we have to do it because of what society requires us to do. It's our way of sort of fitting in to a certain ideal. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think, even though, yes, we've seen examples of models or famous people who have platforms showing off body hair and so on. You know, there was that Nike advert last year where it was quite divided, actually. You know, there are a lot of people who saw these ads with these models showing off their armpit hair. And some people were like, oh my goodness, it's so progressive. And other people like, oh my goodness, it's so disgusting. And I still think we're still there. I don't think things have changed that much. Culture dictates how people view body hair. I think in China, for instance, body hair feels like quite a natural thing. There's no real taboo around it. But then in India, a lot of Indian women, especially in the upper classes, they don't want to see tufts of hair everywhere, and they don't want to see hairy legs and all of that sort of stuff. So I do think we're not quite there yet where that's going to be deemed normal, because one, the pandemic might just change that. People might think, right, I'm going back out again. socializing again, going on holiday again. And I think all of those old habits might just come back in. Also, as I say, I really believe that culture dictates how we view these things.
To go back to your point of me saying that we've moved on and that there is a certain level of acceptance in the upper echelons of glossy magazines where we have to package it in the most aesthetically pleasing way possible, I totally agree with you. No, we haven't. But I think on an everyday level, and I can think to only one example, it's at the forefront of my mind from last night watching television. But every time I watch Naked Attraction, for the most part, men are always quite astounded that women are so cleanly shaven. And the comment they often make is, well, I really don't mind hair at all. So I think there's still a disparity between what's appropriate for a magazine cover or what people deem to be appropriate for a magazine cover and actually what's going on in a normal woman's life. And on your point of societal expectations and cultural norms, regardless of how much, say, this cover has been celebrated and how much positive feedback there's been around it, there is still a strange revulsion to body hair. Like, it's gross to look at and it's somehow thought to be unhygienic, despite the fact that that's never a criticism that would be leveled at a man. You just can't imagine men being like, mate, I can't believe you haven't shaved your armpits. That's really grimy. Yet it feels like a comment that people can level at women who don't, and feels like it is just a way to preserve cultural norms that men can have hair where they like, but women must shave and share themselves to oblivion.
I agree. And it's interesting that you made that point about the men in the show saying that they don't understand why women shave absolutely everything and get rid of all of their hair because they don't mind. And I think it's come to the point where, yes, there are probably a proportion of women who do it for men, but I think we're at a point where it's almost like a kind of internalized misogyny in some ways, where we feel that we have to self-edit in order to fit into these societal ideals. I was doing a little bit of research on this actually, and I came across this detail on this Gillette advert in 1915. They launched the first ever razor, especially for women. And this ad promised to, and I quote, remove the humiliating growth of hair on face, neck, and arms. And I thought, oh my goodness, it referred to shaving as a refinement that has become a modern necessity. And it's amazing how, going back to that Nike advert, again, the way the reaction was so mixed was a real indication that we haven't moved on much. I think even on a normal level, everyday level, I don't think we've moved on much. It'll be interesting to see what happens post-pandemic. The beauty comparison app Cosmetify said that 45% of people have stopped buying hair removal products such as razors and wax strips, which I think initially at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of people thought, I need to get those things. And now they're not so much thinking about that. But I think what happens post-pandemic will be quite significant.
I agree with what you're saying, but I think we've moved on to enough of an extent for this kind of an image and this kind of a statement to be on the front of a glossy women's magazine. And also, it's worth noting, in a spread in GQ, which is obviously a magazine for men, for that not to incite such a divisive and vitriolic reaction. So I totally agree that we've still got a long way to go. But I think also since that Gillette advert, which just sounds crazy now, but I think there is progress to be celebrated in the meantime, even though we've got so much further to go.
Definitely, we've moved on somewhat. And I guess when we get to a point where we don't even have these conversations, then I think then will be the real stamp of, yes, we've definitely moved on, right?
Exactly. I'm always reminded when we have these kinds of chats, the Julia Roberts picture, and everybody assumed that it was like a big statement, you know, of her at the Notting Hill premiere. She lifted her arm and had an unshaven pit. And everyone assumed it was this big statement, but actually it was just that she hadn't had time. And that kind of just sums it up really, doesn't it?
I'd actually forgotten about the Julia Roberts thing. And for me, that was such a moment. I kind of loved her more. And the weird thing is that every time I think about Julia Roberts then, and I think about that tuft of hair, I felt like I wanted to braid it. I know that's the weirdest thing, but I felt like It felt like it needed to be braided.
I don't think you should admit to that on your podcast because you might get some quite strange requests and responses.
Oh, goodness me. Fantastic. Right. I think let's go. I'll stop laughing.
Slightly off piece.
Oh, that was so funny. But that's what I think of every time I see it because there was so much of it. And then it was like such a big deal, right?
I know.
Right. The second feature we're looking at today is from The Guardian. According to Bloody Good Period, a charity that gives period products to those who can't afford them. And this has risen sharply since the coronavirus crisis began. They've said that they're supplying almost 6 times as many menstrual products compared to before the pandemic started. And I have to say, I read this article and I just found it so depressing. You know, those products, I think they should be free. They're a basic need and everyone should have access to them.
So obviously, as you've said, the pandemic has compounded an already really pressing problem. And I don't think anybody listening needs you or I to tell them how much inequity there is in something so basic. But I guess when you consider the fact that sanitary products are still regarded as non-essential luxury items by certain people in Westminster, then it becomes clear why it is such a problem. The fight to even abolish tampon tax is so hard won, demonstrated by the fact that it's not even come into effect yet. And then there's the issue of supply in schools. And that's a recent development, but it's one that's come to be relied upon by so many, the fact that there are sanitary products in schools. And I think it's interesting in this context as well, because we're rightly focused on school meals and all the brilliant and necessary work that Marcus Rashford's doing for kids around the country. But where's the period equivalent? Because just as children going to school is their only chance to get a meal, for many going to school is their only chance to get sanitary products. So the conversation and the understanding and the impetus just isn't there. Everybody in the world understands the urgency for food, but far fewer understand the urgency for sanitary products. Menstruation has been treated as such a source of shame for so long. And this just furthers and compounds the fact that periods continue to burden and discourage and distract women from getting on with their lives and young girls. And it speaks to a larger issue at play, which is that it's all very well Gabby's brilliant charity distributing much needed products, but again, we need to alter the minds of the masses so that these things can be spoken about with the same reverence and in the same kind of arenas as the school meals crisis.
I completely agree with you. I mean, this whole idea of periods being shrouded in shame, it's a real thing. There are so many people who, one, don't really want to talk about it or don't see it as an issue. I remember speaking about this issue actually months ago when the pandemic started, and I was speaking to someone in this industry about it. Shelves are empty because people are stockpiling. They're stockpiling even on tampons and so on. And earlier in the year, this charity, Bloody Good Period, they had to supply menstrual products to NHS workers because they couldn't get to the shops to buy these period products. And when they did, the shelves were empty because of the stockpiling issue. And I remember speaking to someone about this and she was so dismissive. And she was like, oh, people can always find sanitary stuff. It's not an issue. And I think there's still a lot of ignorance around it. You know, people have lost their jobs. People are being pushed into financial hardship. We're seeing people using toilet paper, socks, newspaper, bits of cloth, or not changing them frequently enough, which obviously leads to infections. And I think people aren't really thinking about this really deeply because it's not something that affects them. And then the whole idea of periods being something that's shameful. So the people who are affected won't talk about it. And the people who can maybe even help in this area won't talk about it. You know, when you think about it, as women, you know, at work, and I've caught myself doing it, you walk to the loo and your tampon is stuffed up your sleeves. You know, we're embarrassed to buy sanitary towels if there are men serving at the counter or there are a lot of people around. Muslim women are excluded from fasting and praying during Ramadan. And in some Christian denominations, if you're on your period, you can't come to church. You know, if a woman gets a period stain, I mean, like, God forbid, it's like the worst thing that could happen. I don't know if you watched I May Destroy You with Michaela Cole. You know the scene I'm talking about where she has sex on her period, and it's not so much as the stains that were on the bed, but the clots. And, you know, she talked about being a heavy bleeder, and you kind of watched it slightly horrified. But I think one of the really positive things about that, I think it opens up that subject around periods and addresses the taboo around it. And I think it's important to start talking about it and being open about it, because it's shrouded in way too much secrecy and shame, which is very odd for something that is like the most natural, normal thing.
To go back to the wholly discouraging conversation you had with somebody about how readily available and accessible period products are, there's some stats on Gabby's website, Bloody Good Period. So an asylum seeker receives just shy of 40 quid a week to live on, and the average pack of tampons costs £2.37. It's crazy when you put these figures together and actually think about them from the perspective of somebody who really has to count their pennies and really just can't afford to go out and buy myriad products and keep them and have a surplus to cover all eventualities. And it is heartbreaking to think of girls stuffing newspapers, socks, etc. in their knickers.
I think Good Bloody Period are doing a great job. And for anyone who's listening, please do go on their site. It's very easy to remember, bloodygoodperiod.com. There's a myriad of ways that you can help, whether it's volunteering or whether it's donating or whether it's just helping get the word out there and educating people around this area.
One last point I wanted to make was these stats and all these people suffering and the work that Gabby's doing, that's the kind of thing we need to keep in mind when we have wider discussions about whether our periods are sustainable. You know, it's such a privilege to have a sustainable period. Women do not need to be shamed for not having organic pads and tampons and reusable underwear and moon cups. All these things are so dependent on private and sanitary environments. Moon cups need cleaning and sterilizing. Cloth pads need water, washing machines, etc. So we really do have to think about the bigger picture when we're being a bit imperious with our preaching on sustainability.
That's a really brilliant point. Right, our final piece. It's a New York Times piece called What is Self-Care Now Anyway? And it's an interview with the author Leigh Stein. She's the author of a new novel, Self-Care, which is basically a send-up of the wellness industry, and it touches on our obsession with hashtag self-care. So I've literally just ordered this book. I know you're sort of halfway through yours. I found this absolutely fascinating. The author said it was pitched to publishers as, and this made me laugh, as American Psycho in a goop universe. But in place of the psychopathic murderer, there are all these women taking each other down online in the name of feminism. Oh my goodness.
It's such a brilliant and wry satirical take on self-care, the wellness industry, and girl boss feminism. So quick top line. 2 women have started a wellness-focused social network called Ritual, which crucially is spelt Richual. And to borrow a quote from the book, the platform aims to connect, cure, and catalyze women to be global change makers through the simple act of self-care. So it is a novel, but it could well be nonfiction because it so perfectly skewers the hypocrisy and all the flaws of self-care, dives into faux feminism, startup culture, cattiness, the whole lot. Is brilliant. Leigh Stein is obviously fascinated by it, how flimsy and elastic a concept self-care is. And she really explores this through her main characters. So her both 2 characters occupy very different spaces in the wellness world. One is a vocal feminist who hustles hard and really loves her body no matter what. And the other one is a slightly neurotic, orthorexic woman who's basically a Paltrow-esque poster child of wellness. I won't go too much further into what happens in the book, but rather use this as a platform to echo what Leigh Stein grapples with self-care and how pervasive and in certain instances pernicious the whole industry has become in our lives. Self-care has been distorted and diluted to such an extent that anything goes. So as long as you're doing it for self-care or for self-preservation or optimization, so it enables us to do all sorts of dubious things and just package it as self-care, and that's supposed to fly. We can switch off from anything that's going on around us because the news might not be good for our mental health. By saying now that you're practicing self-care, it's about reclaiming your time and your self-worth and your agency. But sometimes I think, to what effect? Because one of the stats quoted in the piece is that millennials spend double what boomers do on self-care, but actually their mental health, their happiness, and their general dispositions are no better. If anything, they're worse. And, you know, the general malaises of anxiety and depression, etc., haven't changed. So something's going wrong, that we're spending so much money on something. It's not ameliorating any of the symptoms.
That's one of the things that I picked up on this. I thought, surely something must be amiss, because as the world of self-care and wellness booms, I think it's $10 billion. The rates of depression and anxiety are going up, despite the fact that we're on this self-care road or route or whatever it is. When she talks about self-care, within this interview, she actually says that she's not anti-self-care, as it were. You know, that true self-care doesn't actually cost anything. It's drinking water, it's getting enough sleep, it's going outside occasionally to get your vitamin D or whatever it is. Her issue really is about the more consumerist form of self-care. And she said something here that made me laugh so much. She said, if you go on the Goop website, there are products for problems you didn't even know you had. Like, I didn't know I needed to lighten my eyelids until I saw this eyelid brightening cream. I thought that was very funny. And I think that's the issue with it. For me, certainly, it's just yet another way of commercializing people's insecurities. I mean, it's all part of capitalism, essentially, isn't it? The interpretation of self-care has become so subjective, but to the point of ridiculousness, I think.
Exactly. And when you think that this term was conceived for and by Black women, yet it's been co-opted by white middle-class women, it's even more uncomfortable.
Yeah, we could have an entire talking point, which is just about the whiteness of the wellness industry. Maybe we'll get you to come back on and we can talk about that.
Anytime.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
It's now time for In Praise Of. This is a segment of the show where we laud the merits of a single beauty product. This week, it's Murad's Retinol Youth Renewal Eye Serum. Where to start with this retinol eye serum? I love it so much, I could literally fill the airwaves with one big gush. And the irony is this, I generally can't stand eye creams. Not because I enjoy staring at the puffiness and creases under my eyes, and not because I can't be bothered with the faff of applying yet another thing to my face. No. My issue with eye creams is this, most of the options on the market don't work. Yep, sorry, I said it. And so when people ask, what eye cream can you recommend? My response was usually silence. Recently, however, this changed. I still rarely recommend eye creams, but when I do, this one makes the cut. Why? Because bottom line, it works. 93% of people who used it saw a reduction in fine lines and wrinkles over 4 weeks. I mean, how do you argue with that? What sets this eye cream apart from others, however, is the epic formulation. It includes retinol, that gold standard skin smoothing ingredient that everyone needs to have in their kit. But there's a difference here. Where retinol has a reputation for being quite harsh, i.e. you'd never really use it around the delicate eye area, this one has been formulated with a fast-acting but slow-release retinol technology, so you can actually use it to smooth the under-eye creases on even the most sensitive eye areas, and you can use it over your lids, which is really unusual. The texture is light, the hydration is intense, it's around 24 hours, and the brightening effect is real. So please, stop wasting your money on those useless eye creams that promise to revitalize your eyes. If you really want to revitalize your eyes, just stick to, I don't know, slices of cucumber. If you want something that actually does a proper grown-up job, then just get this and be done with it. Now, talking points. My guests are Olamide Olowe and Claudia Teng, the founders of Topicals, the new science-backed beauty brand that everyone's talking about. They join me to share their inspirations behind Topicals and why it has been labeled the coolest beauty brand of 2020. Claudia, Olamide, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having us. We're really excited to be here.
I'm super excited to have you. So I was immediately drawn to topicals because firstly, as founders, you're so young. And I mean that with the greatest of respect. You know, you're 23, 24. I thought that was incredible in and of itself. Then I also found your packaging compelling and the concept behind the brand was brilliant. So for all those who haven't actually heard of topicals, Olamide, perhaps you might be able to share a little bit more about the brand and what inspired it.
Sure. Our brand is inspired by our own experiences with chronic skin conditions. Both Claudia and I grew up with a ton of skin conditions. I have acne, I have dark spots, ingrown hairs, boils, and Claudia grew up with super severe eczema and seborrheic dermatitis. And so we grew up as the girls who we always say were outsiders. You know, we were the girls who you didn't see on the cover of magazines, on your favorite Teen Vogue magazine or, 17 magazine. And so as we were coming of age, we both on our own separate journeys really fell into dermatology and science. I studied pre-med at UCLA and was really fortunate during my sophomore year of college to co-create a beauty brand called Shea Girl in partnership with Shea Moisture. And over those 2 years, I learned so much about what it means to build a brand for underserved communities. And so combining my own experience with this awesome work experience that I was granted through Shea Moisture, I really started to see that you could control what the beauty landscape looked like if you had, the power to do so. And so I met Claudia through a mutual friend, and the idea from Topicals blossomed from there. And I think Claudia can tell you a little bit about her background and how that is intertwined with our story.
Yeah, sure. So like Olamide said, we both kind of fell into dermatology because of our shared experience growing up with skin conditions. I went the more scientific route. So I started working in dermatology clinical research when I was in high school as a research assistant at Stanford's Department of Dermatology, and was lucky enough to be able to research things like non-melanoma skin cancers, eczema, and a rare genetic disease called epidermolysis bullosa. And working in clinical research in dermatology for so long taught me a lot about not only drug development and how to think through the development of therapeutics for skin conditions, but it also helped really bring me close to patients' pain points in their user experience. What were they lacking in their user experience? Where did they feel like their skincare routines and the things that they were using for their skin conditions could do more for them? And I also noticed that there were huge disparities in people's access to healthcare and people's education around their skin. And I knew that Olamide was looking to start a skincare brand that democratized people's access to, one, really great skincare products that are science-backed, and also that provided better resources around educating people, not only in regards to their skin health, but their mental health as well, and how those two things are connected.
When I read your story, I thought to myself, yep, this all sounds like a pretty solid reason to develop a new brand. I personally haven't come across anything addressing those specific issues in the way that Topicals is. And yet I know that initially it was a struggle to raise finances. We know that historically, women starting businesses tend to find it more difficult to get financing than men, especially non-white women. And Claudia, you're Asian American, and Olamide, you're Nigerian American. And I know for women who are non-white, it's even tougher. There are figures a couple of years ago that show out of $85 billion in funding, less than 1% went to women of color. But nevertheless, you managed to raise 2.6 million, which is really impressive. Tell me, how did you go about this and what was the process like? Because I've read that in the beginning, certainly you encountered quite a lot of racism and ageism.
Yeah, we definitely did. It took us 2 years to raise the money, and it was quite the journey. I think looking at where we are now, I think both of us are so grateful to see how in just 3 short months, Topicals has unfolded. Because if you would have told us this would happen, a year ago, even 6 months ago before we were going to launch, we would have been like, there's no way. Us raising that amount of money, like the amount of people who told us no on the way there, it was just so hard to, I guess, look up and see what the future could be. And so it's exciting now, though, that we found the absolute best partners to join us on this ride over our 2-year period, pitching to investors. We pitched to north of about 150 investors. And every one of them was no until, the last couple of investors that we chatted with. And so a lot of them, just like you said, saw us as two young women of color. And the questions we usually got were, how did you two figure this out? And we say like things are kind of like microaggressions, right? It's like half-heartedly, like, wow, y'all are so smart. But at the same time, how did two young women of color figure this massive market out that everyone else missed? How did the incumbents miss this? How did other people who maybe in that investor's mind had more smarts or had more connections, how did they miss this? It's extremely daunting as you're going. Another example is I went to a pitch event and sat down. It was a speed pitching event. So you'd sit for about 3 minutes, pitch with someone, and then move on to someone else. And I sat down after maybe my second or third investor that I had chatted with and said, "Hi, my name is Olamide Aloe. My company is called Topicals." And before I could finish my sentence, the investor said, "That's a really weird name." I mean, for me, I'm thrown off, right? I can't even, I'm trying to get my mojo back to get back into the pitch. But the whole meeting, I'm thinking, this person doesn't even think I'm, I don't know what they think, but.
This person was talking about your name.
My name.
Oh my
it directly to my face, right? And so I think there are a lot of microaggressions. I think that's what's a little bit difficult about this process, right? It's a very mental game. One, because you're literally asking people for money, which is something I think as humans, it's a bit hard to do. You're trying to get someone to believe in you, believe in your idea. And then I think on top of that, being a Black Nigerian woman, I think maybe my features or my name make people uncomfortable. And so I think for me, you go through, and Claudia can attest to this, you go through periods of challenging who you are. Sometimes I would, and I'm being really vulnerable here, but sometimes I would feel like maybe if I wasn't the CEO of this company, maybe if there was someone else that stood in the gap for me as the CEO who was maybe a different ethnicity or maybe a different gender, maybe it'd be so much easier for us to do this. And I used to tell Claudia all the time that I would almost sometimes maybe even apologize, because I would be like, I think we maybe could do this faster if I wasn't the person here. And so that's just how difficult the 2-year journey was. I was an athlete in college. You can train and be the fastest person. Like, nothing can stop you from being the fastest person if you work hard to do that. But in this arena of raising money, it feels as though there's no amount of degrees you can have. There's no amount of smarts that you can have, because there's this invisible racist system that exists that just doesn't allow you to thrive. And so I'm really fortunate, though, now that Claudia and I found the best investors. We spoke with a lot of Black women. We were really excited about Black women and women of color coming onto the cap table and creating wealth through equity. I think for myself, my time at Shea Moisture taught me so much about how do you do well by doing good? How do you give to your community? And how do we create wealth amongst the community? They said in the United States, the Black dollar, the wealth, our wealth is going to zero by 2030. And so I think it's up to people like Claudia and myself, people who are beacons in our community, to extend our arms out to other people in the community who have resources to create joint partnerships so that our community's wealth doesn't go to zero.
Wow. I'm blown away by your story, and I'm blown away by your experience, because we know this kind of thing happens, but it's still quite shocking when it happens, and especially when it's a recent experience. It's still so shocking to me. Now you have a host of incredible investors on board. Bazoma St. John, you've got Issa Rae and Yvonne Orji, and they're predominantly women, your investors, aren't they? And they're incredible women from diverse communities and backgrounds, like you mentioned, which is quite significant in light of everything, in light of the situation, in light of the current climate. This is increasingly important to you, right?
That's exactly right. We had gotten to a point where the brand was a little bit more popular before launch, and we had quite a bit of people from different ethnicities at this point, vying to get into the deal. It was a really hot deal in the summer. So many people were calling us, finding our previous investors and trying to get into their ear about, hey, tell them to take our money, and so it's funny because, like I said, that 2-year period ended up culminating in this almost like fight to the death of people trying to get into the Topicals round. And what I did, which I think it made it more difficult on myself, but I'm really proud of the decisions Claudia and I made around our cap table, is that we decided that we wanted to give more chunks to underserved investors. And so we could have made our deal have maybe even bigger names, or, maybe have finished up quicker. But we decided that we were going to take that extra step to make sure that Black women and women of color were included on the cap table.
Did you find that a lot of people came back to you once the Black Lives Matter movement and protests started kicking off?
Definitely. I think people felt bad because the Black Lives Matter movement to me was so significant, because it was about Black bodies, Black lives being lost. But I think what it really showcased was that in our everyday lives, Black people face microaggressions, or we face these small biases that make our lives really difficult. And I think what happened to a lot of investors that had turned us down before, they were like, oh, maybe my bias was showing in that moment. And so they wanted to come back and revisit, or they had not only, felt a little bit guilty, but also maybe had seen other friends of theirs who were maybe white or not of our same ethnicity see our brand and be really excited about it. And so then they started feeling like, oh, let me get into this one so that I can say, I do support Black founders. When you can get money for your startup, I advise people to take it, as long as the party you're doing the deal with is not completely negative and doesn't have any ties to things that you don't stand for. But I think, unfortunately for us, we don't have the luxury to say, I don't want to take this investment money. I'm going to take this investment money to a certain extent. And so while I know we are all feeling it as people of color, as Black people, that some people are just trying to get into the round just to say they did, I think use their money to, do better for yourself and do better for your community, so that next time someone that looks like you is pitching for money, you're the one that's able to put money into their company versus them having to go and make a deal with someone that maybe doesn't always have their best interest in mind.
That's incredible advice, because a lot of people get incredibly caught up with the concept of brands that are Black founded without realizing that actually it might have a Black founder, but in terms of the investment, it's a mix. It's not just Black investors. And that idea that you're putting forward, that no, take the money as long as it aligns with your values and then use it to serve your community. I think that's an excellent piece of advice. And I think that a lot of people who are thinking of setting up brands, it's something that they could really do well taking on board. Go ahead, Claudia, you had some things to say.
Yeah, I think what I really appreciated about the Black Lives Matter movement that really sort of gained momentum this past summer was that the call to action was really, how do we value Black people and how we value the Black community? And it was very much like, put your money where your mouth is, which I think is a much more effective call to action than I think it has necessarily been in the past. I think that's an important thing that people have been talking about and getting more educated around, is like, we can talk and we can protest and we should be having these conversations, but larger than that, how do you bring that to action? And a lot of that is putting your money where your mouth is and valuing them with actual dollars and cents.
Well, the response to the brand has been incredible. I mean, especially when it was launched against the backdrop of the pandemic, of the Black Lives Matter movement, as we talked about, and a real societal shift in essentially how we're living and how we're engaging with the world. And you launched in that time, and the product sold out in 48 hours. Is that something that you predicted would happen?
No, I don't think that we anticipated that at all. Actually, when we were building our inventory prior to launch, we contemplated and actually scaled back a little bit, because we were expecting that everything that was happening with COVID especially would really sort of make things difficult for us when we wanted to launch. So we actually took steps to sort of scale back our stock and our inventory. And I think it was so rewarding to see that our efforts in community building, our efforts getting people talking about causes and things that we thought were really significant and important and weren't being talked about enough, ended up being fruitful in a way. And we were really appreciative and blown away by the demand that we saw at launch.
Let's talk about the actual products. I mean, you've had some stellar reviews, and I know we don't have them here, and I'm on good authority that they'll be winging their way over the Atlantic very soon. So watch this space, everyone. Talk to me about the current lineup.
We only have 2 products currently. So our first product is our Faded Brightening and Clearing Gel. It's a serum that is targeted towards dark spots and discoloration. And then our second SKU is a product called Like Butter. It's a hydrating mask, hydrating face mask for dry, sensitive, and eczema-prone skin. So it's a great hydrating mask for when your skin is feeling stressed out, or especially coming up during these winter months where the humidity goes down and a lot of people develop seasonal eczema. This is a really great face mask for that.
I'm interested to know your thinking behind launching those 2 products first, because certainly with a lot of skincare brands, they tend to start with a cleanser, then a moisturizer, and then they fit all those other things in between. What was your thinking behind launching those 2 products first?
Well, when you have a skin condition, I think one thing is that your routine, your skincare routine, you're used to it being super complicated. You try a ton of different things to figure out what works best for your skin. If you have access to a physician, then your physician might be giving you prescriptions that you also have to learn how to incorporate. And people's routine tends to become this sort of unwieldy thing that they're constantly having to sort of play detective around. And one thing that we knew that we always wanted to do with topicals when we talk about improving people's experience using skincare for their skin conditions is we wanted to simplify it. We wanted to uncomplicate it and try to make people's routines feel as easy as possible and as fun as possible. So we knew that we wanted to sit in the targeted treatment space and create products that were so power packed with all of the actives that you would need to help you manage a certain condition, where you didn't have to be piecemealing together 12 different serums or 12 different products and trying to figure out how they layer on top of one another. So that was really important to us when we were thinking through what products we would launch. And that's why we've stayed so focused in creating just really targeted solutions for people's skin concerns and skin conditions.
And lastly, I'd love to know from both of you if there's a key message that you'd really love to put out there with this brand, because what's great about the brand is it's not just about products. There's so much that it's saying to the world, just in terms of how we view skin, how we view skin conditions, our idea of beauty and what beauty looks like. And even you as founders, I feel that you're sending a message out to the world with just the way that you look. People would say they don't look like CEOs of a company.
I like to tell everyone that you can literally do anything that you want to do. If you put your mind to it and you put a plan together, you can do it. I think Claudia and I both didn't think that we could be in this position, but we just kept moving forward. We kept putting plans together. When things would fall in our face, we kept getting back up. And I think for people who want to start brands or want to be CEOs, want to be co-founders of companies, I think really what it is one, to get educated on whatever category you're trying to go into. My mom used to always say, you want to be the expert of your category. You want to know so much that people de facto trust you, trust your opinion because they believe that you know what you're saying. We've talked a lot about mental health as a company as it relates to beauty and the fact that there is a deep connection between skin health and mental health. And so we've to date donated $11,000 and will continue to do so and release resources to help people go deeper and find more meaning in that sector.
Echoing Olamide, another thing that we really want topicals to do truly is transform the way that people feel about skin. We think that there's so much room and there's so much work to be done in sort of raising awareness around the connection between skin health and mental health. That's what we always talk about. And so we hope that we can continue to do that with our community.
Thank you so much, Olamide and Claudia. Thank you for joining me today. It's been lovely having you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, we really appreciated having this conversation with you.
And that's it for this week. My thanks to Phoebe McDowell, Olamide and Claudia from Topicals, my brand partner Murad Skincare, and you for listening to On Reflection.